My paper aims to look at the different antiquities laws that were in place during the time that Cyprus was part of the British Empire, and how these laws affected the dispersal of antiquities outside of the island. In particular, I would first like to present how the law changed from 1878, when Cyprus was ceded to Britain, to 1935, when a new, more comprehensive antiquities law was passed. In the second part of my paper, I would like to discuss as an example the American excavations at Lapithos that took place in 1931-32. When we look at these excavations and read the laws that were in effect, together with archival documents, such as correspondence and export permits, we can see how the law at that time provided only general guidelines and was not enforced in a consistent manner. As a result, the division of material between excavators and the host country and its subsequent dispersal was dictated by political circumstances and influenced by personal preferences, shipment and storage issues, and the desire to create or enrich collections of antiquities at various museums. Now, let's look at the law. There are 4 pieces of legislation that are relevant to our case: the Ottoman Land Code, the first antiquities law of the Ottoman Empire, the 1905 antiquities law, and the 1935 antiquities law. Cyprus was part of the Ottoman Empire from 1570 and until 1878, when Great Britain took over the administration of the island and ruled it as a British protectorate. Under these conditions, Cyprus remained formally part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman law remained in force. From 1878 and until 1946, so not that long ago, the legal status of any plot of land was the same as during the Ottoman period, meaning that it was regulated by the Ottoman Land Code of 1869. This was despite the fact that the British had already carried out general land surveys in Cyprus at the end of the 19th century and later in the early 20th century, with important implications in the preservation of the archaeology of the island. Now, the legal status of the land goes hand in hand with the ownership and protection of the antiquities that are found in any plot. The Ottoman Land Code divided land into 5 categories, with the 2 most important categories being mulk and aratsi mirie. Mulk land provided legal ownership and the right of possession to the owner, whereas aratsi mirie land provided legal ownership to the treasury and the right of possession to the cultivators who were leasing the land from the government. In 1946, when the immovable property law passed under the British, the landowners had full ownership, possession, and use of their land. The first antiquities law by the Ottoman Empire was introduced in 1874, only 4 years before Cyprus was ceded to the British. The systematic looting of source countries, often by diplomatic or other government officials, and the enactment of legislation as a consequence to regulate the looting was a common phenomenon. Likewise, this law was provoked by the systematic looting of antiquities that took place in Cyprus between 1865 and 1876, the years that Luigi Palma di Cesnola was active on the island. The Ottoman law stated that any antiquity discovered underground belonged to the government and that an official permit was necessary for excavation. However, the law also recognized the right to the division of artifacts between the excavators, the landowners, and the empire, while the ownership of the cultural heritage was vested in the empire. This somewhat controversial statement is common in the antiquities laws of the time, and it basically ensures that the state can choose first and keep antiquities, while also giving away what is not wanted. The Ottoman law was quite liberal towards the export of antiquities, since it allowed their export from any part of the empire with permission from the government. If the government wished to acquire certain objects, it would pay the price agreed with the owner, while the rest could be exported. When Cyprus passed to the British in 1878, the Ottoman laws were gradually amended to meet the needs of the new empire. However, with the exception of the Famagusta Stones Law of 1891, which prohibited the removal of stones from the ruined buildings of the old town of Famagusta, the British maintained the 1874 Ottoman law for almost 30 years. One of the first actions of the colonial government with respect to the antiquities of Cyprus was to establish a place for their storage and display. Thus, in 1882, under the existing antiquities law, the first museum was established in Nicosia, maintained by private donations. Now, during this 30-year period between 1878 and 1905, there is a discrepancy with the law provision for the export of antiquities. In 1884, the Ottoman law was amended by forbidding all exports of antiquities. As we've seen, Cyprus was still formally part of the Ottoman Empire, even if under the administration of the British as a protectorate. However, when the Ottoman Empire asked that all export of antiquities from Cyprus be stopped, the High Commissioner replied that since the law had passed after the island was ceded to Britain, it did not apply to Cyprus. The first law on antiquities actually enacted during the British period was the Antiquities Law of 1905. This was the first effective law introduced to protect and govern the antiquities and ancient monuments of Cyprus, and it contained 8 sections that dealt with monuments, excavations, export and acquisition of antiquities, museums, and financial issues. Right from the start, antiquities, discovered and undiscovered, movable and immovable, are declared as the absolute property of the government. A museum committee is established with the purpose of governing the museum and enforcing the law. Anyone already in possession of antiquities must submit a list to the government and accept possible inspection by the museum committee. In addition, people accidentally discovering antiquities must notify the authorities, otherwise be subject to penalties. From any immovable antiquities discovered, a third will be taken by the government, a third will go to the landowner, and a third will be kept by the finder. Part 3 of the law deals specifically with excavations. Any antiquities discovered during excavations carried out by the museum committee belong to the government. No excavations can be carried out on any land without a permit by the museum committee. Penalties are set both for illegal excavations and for buying illegally excavated antiquities. In the case of legal excavations, the excavator has no right in any of the antiquities discovered. Nonetheless, the excavator is entitled to a record in duplicate of all the finds. The museum committee may grant to the excavator permit to make copies, give to the excavator duplicate antiquities, or any antiquities not required by the committee. So basically what happened here is not that the division of finds was abolished, but rather the decision about the division of finds was moved to the hands of the colonial government. Part 4 of the law prohibits the export of antiquities without written permission of the High Commissioner. Any antiquities to be exported must be checked by the museum committee to ensure that antiquities of the same kind and quality are in the museum's exhibits or that the committee does not require them. Now, we're all familiar here with the work of the Swedish Cypriot Expedition. However, what perhaps is not known to everybody is that in 1927, the Antiquities Law underwent an amendment regarding the division of finds from excavations, which was directly connected to the arrival of the Swedes. Specifically, it was decided that the excavators will receive a share of the finds, which will be fixed by the museum committee after the end of the excavations. In addition, the museum committee could grant to the excavators the agreed share of any antiquities found according to the excavation permit. The same year, after the amendment of the law, the Swedish Cypriot Expedition arrived on the island and systematically excavated a large number of sites throughout Cyprus. The expedition was entitled to half of the excavation finds as a result of the aforementioned amendment. However, out of the 18,000 objects that were unearthed, the Swedes took home 12,000 objects, amounting to 2/3 of the finds. In fact, the Prince of Sweden, who funded part of the expedition, came to Cyprus to supervise the division of the finds himself. Receiving 2/3 of the finds was a great exception to the existing law, which has been attributed to the generosity of the governing authorities and their desire to please the Swedish Crown Prince. This, in turn, may have been related to public concern that the ban in the export of antiquities made Cyprus a less attractive destination for foreign expeditions. Nonetheless, the 771 boxes full of Cypriot artifacts at the port of Famagusta, ready to be shipped to Stockholm, are indicative of the rate in which Cypriot antiquities left the island at that time. In any case, It was exactly the work of the Swedish Cypriot Expedition and the attraction of international interest to the archaeology of Cyprus that drew the interest of the colonial government and strengthened the need for the enactment of a new law and a stronger body to govern matters related to antiquities. In 1935, 10 years after Cyprus became officially a crown colony, a new law was passed to consolidate and amend the existing law relating to antiquities. The new Antiquities Law established the Department of Antiquities with Hilton as its first director, succeeded a year later by McGaugh. Once again, all undiscovered antiquities were declared property of the government. Antiquities accidentally discovered by unlicensed people had to be delivered to the authorities. After inspection, the director of antiquities could keep them for the Cyprus Museum or offer them to the trustees of the British Museum. Unlike the 1905 law, the new law did not provide the finder or the landowner a share of the antiquities. Instead, the finder received a sum of money. If neither the Cyprus Museum nor the British Museum wanted the antiquities, then the finder would be allowed to retain, sell, or dispose the antiquities. As we can see in this case, there is a three-tiered process in the management of antiquities, with the colonial government maintaining a stronghold on their dispersal and allowing the British Museum to acquire pieces that may be of interest. With regard to excavations, the Director of Antiquities has power to excavate. No excavation can be carried out without written license by the Director. Application for excavation can be made only by scholars supported by archaeological societies or institutions, limiting in this way access to excavation permits and promoting a scientific approach to the archaeology of Cyprus. At the end of an excavation, or at any point that the director deems necessary, he can, quote, select and acquire for the Cyprus Museum without payment any antiquities which are in his opinion required for the scientific complement of the museum or for the purpose of illustrating the history or art of Cyprus, end quote. The director will then divide the remaining antiquities, aiming at giving the excavator half of the finds. In this respect, the excavator may be gifted items from the collection of the Cyprus Museum that are not required, or if not possible, the excavator shall receive compensation. Overall, the Antiquities Law of 1935 provided a stronger legal status over the antiquities of Cyprus. The law was updated various times after its enactment. Its first amendment, and probably the most important one, took place in 1964 after the establishment of the Republic of Cyprus. The amendment maintained that, quote, all antiquities which the holder of the license or the person, society or institution on whose behalf he acts may discover throughout the duration of the excavation shall vest in the Cyprus Museum without any payment whatsoever, end quote. This ended the division of fines between the excavator and the host country, quite late when compared with other source countries, and was the real beginning of the protection of Cypriot cultural heritage. For the first time, and unlike the previous laws of antiquities, this amendment that followed the independence of the island was not drafted by a colonial power and did not seek to enrich museum collections of another empire, but rather aimed at boosting the confidence of the citizens of the new republic. Now, with this background in mind, let me turn to the American excavations at Lapithos. The story that I would like to tell is based on the rediscovery in the archives of the Penn Museum of the correspondence between the members of the American expedition to Lapithos. Within these letters, we can follow the process of the excavation, the long journey that took the material from Lapithos to Philadelphia, and the degree of adherence to the existing laws. The Pennsylvania Cyprus expedition to Lapithos was directed by Bert Hodge, a former director of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. Hill, who until then had never visited Cyprus, nor did he have much interest in Cypriot archaeology, was approached by Horace Jane, the director of the Penn Museum, and was offered $5,000 in support of the expedition. This was a time of increased international interest in the archaeology of Cyprus, and as we've seen under the existing laws, it was an opportunity for foreign museums to enrich their own collections, something that is clearly visible in the selection of Lapithos as the site for excavation. Hill made his first trip to Cyprus in May and June of 1931 and he visited the sites of Neapaphos and Palepaphos, Kourion, Amathus, Kition, Tamassos, Idalion, Kythrea, Vouni, Soloi, Aierini, and Lapithos. At the end of his trip, he wrote, "Were it simply a question of archaeological service to Cyprus, I should have favored Paphos, but of course that is not the sole consideration, and I should in fact have thought to apply for it only if you had chanced to express a preference for it. As between the other two sites, I take Lapithos first, though it is much less important historically, because the known cemeteries with which we should begin in either case show a greater range of periods, and Lapithos is situated 40 miles nearer to the well-arranged collections and convenient working library of the museum. And thus, more because of political conditions, somewhat antiquarian reasons, and convenience than because of its perceived scientific value, the Americans began their work in Lapithos. Hill arrived with a team of women to assist their excavation, all members of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens: Dorothy Hannah Cox, Lucy Talcott, and Virginia Grace. And I have to say here that it's to the credit of these women that we have the documentation that is available for this material. Work at Lapithos began on September 23, 1931, and proceeded smoothly until Christmas. During that time, the expedition excavated 38 Bronze Age tombs at Brisindubarpa on the coast, 20 geometric tombs at Airkodissa, also on the coast, and 26 tombs, geometric tombs in the center of the village on the Gastros Plateau. From the correspondence, we learn about the agreements that had to be made with the various landowners of the plots that were excavated, which actually reflect the 1905 law. Following the precedent of the Swedish expedition, and at the special desire of the Cyprus Museum, our agreements with owners of land gave them no share in the value of objects found. Until comparatively recently, they have been entitled to 1/3 as they are in Greece, but we paid them actually for gold or silver found by weight. The division of finds from the American expedition followed the 1905 law and was to be arranged between the visiting expedition and the hosting authorities. After the inspection of the finds, the Cyprus Museum Committee decided to keep tomb 474, the richest Cypro-geometric tomb excavated, a bronze trainer from the same cemetery, one complete tomb group from the Bronze Age cemetery of Brisindubarpa, and selected objects from 9 tombs from the same cemetery. Everything else was awarded to the Penn Museum. Unfortunately, and much to Hill's disappointment, who wanted to return to Lapithos for a second season, the Penn Museum was so affected by the financial situation in the US that in April 1932, they sent the following cablegram: "Regret cannot continue expedition, stop. Balance must cover all costs, stop." This marked the beginning of the diaspora of the finds of the Pennsylvania Cyprus expedition. Since the Penn Museum was unable to host all the finds awarded to it, Hill was asked to ship only the best tomb groups and representative examples of the other objects. On May 28, 1932, 30 cases of pottery were shipped from Larnaca to Trieste by the company Lloyd Triestino, and from there they were transshipped to Philadelphia. The finds that arrived at the Penn Museum were unpacked, remended, photographed, and catalogued in the autumn of 1932, while the rest of the finds remained temporarily at the Cyprus Museum. In 1935, with the improvement of the financial conditions in the US and the involvement of McFadden, Hill returned to Cyprus and initiated excavations at Kourion. This raised justified criticism regarding the American expedition to Cyprus, which was worsened by the fact that a lot of the material from the expedition was still at the Cyprus Museum. In order to save their reputation in Cyprus, the Penn Museum secured a small grant for Virginia Grace for the study of the material from Lapithos, with the hope that it would result in a small publication for the University Museum Bulletin. The presence of the Americans at Kourion brought up again the question of how to deal with the Lapithos finds. In the meantime, during renovation works at the Cyprus Museum, the material from Lapithos was hastily, and perhaps accidentally, sent to Episcopi in Limassol, where the Pennsylvania Cyprus expedition was residing. While the Penn Museum was unable to deal with the finds, the University of Cincinnati, offered to pay for all costs of packing, insurance, and transportation of the material from Episcopi to Cincinnati, and accept the material as a gift. And so, the material was shipped to Cincinnati in 1939 and stored at the Cincinnati Art Museum with minimal processing. In 1965, for reasons that are unclear, the Cincinnati Art Museum was willing to return the objects from Lapithos to the Penn Museum. The new agreement between the two museums was that after their impending study, a small group of vases of quality suitable for exhibition would return to Cincinnati for display. The objects were eventually sent to Philadelphia in two separate installments, one in the spring of 1966 and the other in the autumn of the same year. Following the return of the material to Philadelphia, it was not until 1969 that the objects were properly processed and catalogued at the Penn Museum. The long process of cataloging the objects from 1932, when the first objects arrived at the Penn Museum, to 1969 is visible in the accession numbers of the objects, whose first digits indicate the year that they were catalogued. This allows us to see which tomb groups and objects were selected in 1932 by Hill as representative and of better quality, and which languished in Cincinnati until the late 1960s. This brings us to the present. The finds from the Pennsylvania Cyprus expedition are divided today between Philadelphia, Nicosia, and Stockholm. The correspondence relating to the American expedition at Lapithos tells a story not very different from other contemporary expeditions, namely that the preservation and distribution of archaeological finds in the early 20th century was dictated by financial and political circumstances rather than their scientific value. The 1905 Antiquities Law that was in effect during the American excavations did not have provisions for keeping tomb groups intact and for preserving the context of the finds, something on which we place a great emphasis today. The purpose of the 1905 law was to stop the illicit excavations that were taking place at the time on the island and to regulate the dispersal of archaeological finds, both accidental and from controlled excavations. The fact that there was no public funding yet had a negative effect on the degree of protection that could be implemented. Excavators expected to receive a percentage of the finds uncovered as a compensation for their work. However, even if by modern standards the 1905 law was weak, it was an improvement from the previous Ottoman law in that it was drafted specifically for Cyprus, albeit by a colonial power. To conclude, before 1878, archaeological activity in Cyprus was almost synonymous to looting, since the laws in effect under the Ottoman Empire were not strong enough to regulate such activities. Also, this was a time before the establishment of archaeology as a discipline, so there was no real intention in interfering in any so-called archaeological activities. Under the British colonial rule, a number of processes took place that influenced greatly the development of Cypriot archaeology as a discipline, alongside the enactment of legislation for the protection of the archaeology of the island. Nonetheless, there was a strong colonial perspective and a desire to benefit British museums or to satisfy foreign expeditions, as is clearly visible in the antiquities laws, and especially in the articles that regulated the division and export of archaeological finds. In this respect, the 1964 amendment of the law truly marks a change in the perception and protection of the archaeology of Cyprus by forbidding the export of antiquities, putting a stop in the diaspora of archaeological finds and the often subsequent loss of context, and by bringing the protection of the cultural heritage of the island to the forefront. Thank you.